Are we on the verge of a new Cold War with Ukraine as the main battlefield? I'll ask former world heavyweight champion Vitali Klitschko, who just happens to be the mayor of Kiev. I'm Mehdi Hasan, also on the show. Ever since Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez died in 2013, more and more voters have been turning their backs on his so-called Bolivarian revolution, and the economy is in freefall. So is it time to bid farewell to his socialist project? That's our debate. But first, 2 years ago this week, thousands of Ukrainian protesters toppled the country's president, who fled to Russia. Today, the country is beset by political crises, rampant corruption, and a conflict in the east that has led to more than 9,000 deaths. Can Ukraine's new rulers turn things around? One of them is the mayor of Kiev, who in a former life was the world heavyweight champion. So, time for some sparring. This week's headliner, Vitali Klitschko. Vitali Klitschko, thanks for joining me on UpFront. 2 years ago, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians took to the streets against what they believed to be a corrupt authoritarian government. The president, Viktor Yanukovych, fled to Russia. 2 years later, what do you believe has been the number one, the main achievement of that quote-unquote revolution in your country?
People understand right now they have influence, and from opinion, every citizens depend the direction which direction go the country. And right now the country changed, but expectation of people much bigger. Yes, of course, we expect much more changes, much more fight against corruption, much better dynamic to be part of European Union.
You mentioned corruption. 2 years on from Euromaidan, from those mass protests that were prompted partly by anger over corruption, today in Kiev, protesters keep coming back on the streets to protest against corruption again. The IMF, the International Monetary Fund, says it may hold back a crucial bailout unless your government does something about corruption. Why have you and your fellow politicians in Ukraine been unable to tackle corruption?
People thought we change the faces, but not to change the system, and they expect much faster change. Yeah. And that's why the corruption still already we make huge step. I'm responsible for Kiev, and we investigate everything what happens before we find billions of stolen money and give everything to prosecutor office.
Some say that Ukraine is less of a democracy and more of an oligarchy. It's the big business tycoons, the oligarchs in the gas and energy industries who really run your country.
It's not true, but they have huge influence because they have tried to control the media, try to control resources of Ukraine, and also the oligarchs destroy the economy, equal opportunities for our economy because we doesn't have a middle class.
You're currently head of President Petro Poroshenko's political faction in Ukraine. Some say the president himself is an oligarch. Could you explain why, after the president publicly called for the prime minister last week to resign, some say a very bold move, around 30 of your own MPs failed to back a no-confidence motion in his government, and the prime minister, embarrassingly for the president, maybe for you too, survived? He's still the prime minister.
Answer is very clear. Some politician put his ambition over interest of the country. It's a big problem. And the whole country expect changes, fast changes. If you're not good enough, you have to go.
Do you still think the Prime Minister should stand down even after surviving this vote of no confidence?
Right now, it's a question right now for everybody how develop whole situation and in Ukraine. But if politicians,
you'd still like to see him go?
Yes, I told it will be right decision.
The Russian Prime Minister, Dmitry Medvedev, said last week that the West and Russia have, quote, slid into a time of a new Cold War. Ukraine, your country, isn't just in the middle of that Cold War. It's one of the main battlegrounds for that new Cold War. It's one of the causes, some might say, of that new Cold War.
It's right. We have a feeling it's the Cold War starting from Russia. First of all, I grown up in the Soviet Union. My father was Air Force officer, and I remember how works media and propaganda in Russia. It's the main weapons. Right now we understand the media is main weapons in Russians. They invest billions of dollars, and I know how effective that. Today, I told we lose the game, the war against Russia, media war.
But do you believe we are? You believe we are in a Cold War, not just Ukrainians fighting separatists. It's a Cold War between the West and Russia again. You believe?
The Russians, everything what happens right now in Russia remind me as Soviet Union.
It reminds you of Soviet Union.
And the main goal, it's not secret. The main goal of Russia to rebuild the empire, to bring, and without Ukraine. Rebuild the empire almost impossible, and that's why instability comes from east of Ukraine, from Russia.
But isn't there a need then to come to an end, to come to some kind of compromise? You're never going to defeat Russia militarily. Isn't there a need for pragmatic purposes, for practical purposes, to save lives, to just bring this conflict to an end?
Pragmatic movement, what we have to do. We have to implement all part, Ukraine and Russia have to implement Minsk agreement.
Okay, that was the agreement last year that fell apart. You mentioned all the problems come from Russia and the destabilizing, and the Russian-backed separatist rebels have indeed been accused of human rights abuses, of violence, but so too have Ukrainian armed forces and volunteer battalions. Listen to what Amnesty International said last year. Both sides failed to take reasonable precautions to protect civilians. Both placed troops in residential areas. Ukrainian police were involved in torture. Pro-Kiev forces were involved in abductions. Is this the new Ukraine you're trying to build, where all these human rights violations are happening, even under Ukrainian armed forces, Ukrainian police? It's not just the Russian-backed separatists who are committing violations.
I'm sorry. Where's the reason of conflict? Can you give me an answer? Where's the reason for conflict?
That doesn't justify human rights abuses, though, does it?
No.
You can fight them without carrying out torture, abductions.
From the beginning.
This is what Amnesty is saying.
From the beginning. Right now, the right radicals come to the power. The people who headed Russians in Ukrainian government. I told the clear answer how we can head Russians. I am help Russians. My father is Ukrainian, my mother is Russian. In my body is Russian.
And there have been allegations that there are neo-Nazis fighting in volunteer units against Russians.
Nazi's fighting, it's not true. It's everything is propaganda war.
US newspapers, not just Russian newspapers, have documented the Azov battalion and other such groups fighting on the front lines against Russia, who have swastikas on their trucks. It's not true at all?
I doesn't see swastika. I talk to the people. We defend our territory. We defend.
And what about the human rights violations? What do you say about amnesties?
We defend our country.
What about the torture, the abductions, the not protecting civilians, placing troops?
Please,
Amnesty Human Rights Watch.
I don't know what from you take this information.
Amnesty International. You've heard of Amnesty International?
I'm sorry. I come from Ukraine.
Okay, but Amnesty International is a global NGO. Human Rights Watch.
Good example. I meet very high, just a couple of weeks ago in Davos, I meet very high position Russians, and they ask me, you know what is the people with the weapons, with machine guns, going to the street in the Kiev. I told him, I'm sorry, I come from Kiev. What from you take this information? They told me, you know what TV.
So you're saying the Ukrainian forces haven't committed any human rights violations?
The right answer. They create the story and believe in the story.
Okay, so you reject Human Rights Watch, you reject Amnesty International's reports about Ukrainian armed forces committing.
I don't have information. I live in Ukraine.
Okay, you're a big chess player. You've said, quote, chess is similar to
big players.
You're a fan of chess, I believe.
Yeah, okay, I'm a fun player.
You've said chess is similar to boxing. You need to develop a strategy. You need to think 2 or 3 steps ahead of what your opponent is doing. Many would say it's Vladimir Putin who's been 2 or 3 steps ahead of the Ukrainian government, of Western nations, when it comes to the issue of Ukraine, Crimea. He's outwitted you all. Is that fair?
He's a good player. He's a good player, and this game is not easy because he used all strong side what have Russia and in this game, and but anyway.
But what do you think the West should be doing to stop him that they're not doing? What would you like to be seen?
United. It's very important.
Are they not? Is the West not united right now?
United position is very important against Russia. It's Russian instead to instead to invest the money to economy, they invest so much money in secret service, in military, and Russians right now with sanctions have a huge problem.
But do you think the West is not united in its approach to Russia? You're saying you want to see united front. Does that mean it's not united?
I'm more than sure the West have to be united, and united position will be very strong argument against Russia.
And do you foresee a day? Do you foresee a day where there is actual military confrontation between the West and Russia?
I hope not. I hope not. We try to find a solution. It's a diplomatic solution, and but it's not a question about our independence, and not a question about territory of Ukraine. In this way, it's no solution.
President Putin's PR people, you mentioned propaganda earlier in the interview, President Putin's PR people often put out pictures of him topless or working out in the gym or on horseback or engaged in judo. You've been a boxer, a fighter your whole life. Does he intimidate you?
It's his PR strategy. It's not me. As I am former boxer, I have to be topless with boxing gloves, present myself. Sometimes it's looking very funny.
It looks funny. It's not something you're afraid of. It's more something you're laughing at.
No. I'm not afraid. It's some funny pictures.
There are these constant allegations endorsed by the Interior Ministry under President Yanukovych, who you opposed, that you served as a debt collector for this mafia boss, Victor the Fish Rybalko. People make these claims that he was a backer of your boxing career until he was killed in 2005. Is there any truth to those allegations of your relationship with the fish?
Please, don't read the trash information. There's so much trash information around the world and so much speculation. If you come, it's no commentary for that. I don't see the reason to make a commentary for.
Okay. What's the difference? What's the number one difference between being a boxer, trying to be the heavyweight champion of the world, and being a politician in a country like Ukraine?
In boxing, you have clear rules. If you break the rules, you're disqualified. In politics, is a fight, no rules. But
there's supposed to be rules in politics. There's not in Ukraine at the moment?
You know what, young democracy is supposed to be the rules, but I have a feeling as boxer I come to MMA, and worse than MMA because this fight is very, very tough.
Vitali Klitschko, thanks for joining me on UpFront. Thank you.
Thank you.
The Chinese economic miracle has grabbed global attention for a while now. The country has hit its growth targets for 14 out of the last 15 years, and the one time they missed it was by 0.1%. It seems almost too good to be true. So what if it isn't true? Some observers are starting to wake up to the fact that they may have been duped by the official bean counters in Beijing. Now, we already know that the Chinese economy is in the midst of a slowdown. The country's main stock market index took a 30% plunge in June and July last year. Industrial production has dropped, and so have retail sales. Official growth numbers, however, have remained uncannily stable since 2012. So what if the entire premise of a Chinese growth miracle is flawed? You see, the problem with measuring the size of the Chinese economy is that in terms of hard data, you pretty much have to take the government's word for it. And sometimes their word isn't worth much. In 2013, one under-pressure Communist Party official admitted that he had more than doubled the actual growth figures for his county, while another claimed that the investment figures for his province were inflated by 20%. Meh. What's $15.7 billion between friends? Oh, and thanks to good old WikiLeaks, we now know that one of China's most senior leaders, Li Keqiang, has privately admitted that the GDP figures were man-made and, quote, all other figures, especially GDP statistics, are for reference only, he said, smiling, according to the cable. In fact, he himself apparently uses another method to measure his country's economic performance. And according to that unofficial Li Keqiang index, China's growth has more than halved since 2013. So look, this isn't a Western or anti-Chinese conspiracy. They're saying it themselves. And nobody's questioning the fact that the Chinese economy has been booming over the past few decades, or that poverty has been slashed. But it now seems pretty obvious they've also been fiddling a lot of the figures along the way. So next time you hear the Chinese dragon has yet again been slaying all of its economic targets, maybe think myth, not miracle. The leftist revolution initiated by then Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez in 1999 led to unprecedented social change, including falls in poverty, an expansion of healthcare, and a level of equality unmatched in Latin America. But 17 years later, and 3 years since the death of President Chavez, the country is on course for the highest inflation rate in the world, and the opposition now has a majority in parliament for the first time. So did the so-called Chavez revolution die with Chavez? To debate this, I'm joined by Max Arvelaiz, a former advisor to the late president, close confidant to his successor, President Nicolas Maduro, and Venezuela's current ambassador designate to the United States, and Jon Lee Anderson, a staff writer for the New Yorker magazine, who Chavez once called a critical friend, but who said the Chavez revolution never really took place. Gentlemen, thanks for joining me in the arena. Max, let me start with you. Your party, the Socialists, the party created by the late Hugo Chavez, was, for want of a better word, trounced in the parliamentary elections in December in Venezuela. It was the worst ever defeat for your party in its history. Chavez has gone, and so has your popular support, hasn't it?
Well, not exactly. I mean, again, yes, it was a defeat, definitely. But on the other hand, 42% people voted for us, I mean, on that December the 6th. And you should say after 17 years, and I think we had held like 20 elections in 17 years, so it was the first time, you know, that we lost one election. That doesn't mean that this is the end of the Chavismo, or Maduro is still the president, President Maduro is still the president, and now for us is a question to learn from that defeat and to respond to the demand of the people.
Jon Lee Anderson, you wrote these big profiles of Chavez, you interviewed him, travelled with him. Did the Chavez political, social revolution, did Chavismo die with the man himself?
I felt so at the time that he was dying, and I wrote my last piece on Venezuela. And I mean, I would say that certainly developments since then have borne out that perception, or at least that his legacy has been mismanaged. I felt that, I mean, I never had any doubt when I was with Chavez, who was an incredibly charismatic man. He could make any foe smile. He was someone who had a unique ability with his constituents. But I never was convinced that he had built a really deeply and broad-based revolution.
Wasn't broad-based or deep enough, your quote-unquote revolution?
No, I don't think so. I mean, on the contrary, I think definitely that, because you have to remember where we were 20 years ago, before Chavez was elected. I strongly believe that at that time, Venezuela was almost a social and economic apartheid at that time.
But the Chavez social revolution might have been viable and popular in an era in which Venezuela could sell oil at $140 a barrel. Surely it's not viable or popular in an era in which oil is less than $40 per barrel.
We always said that the oil is like a blessing and a curse for Venezuela. So now our responsibility is to make sure that we're going to try to...
But why now? You had 17 years to diversify away from oil.
Well, tell me one single oil producer country that is doing well right now. You know, it's not easy, and we've been trying to do that. But the difference with the past, that 20 or 30 years ago, we have an amazing oil revenue as well, and it didn't benefit for those who needed it.
You're saying which oil economy is doing well, but which oil economy has declared an economic emergency, as the Venezuelan government declared in January, and you're on course, I think, for a 720% inflation rate, the worst in the world, according to some predictions. We can argue about the exact numbers, but it's bad. Inflation is bad in your country.
IMF and usually,
the inflation is bad in your country, the growth figures are bad, and your government has declared an economic emergency. You have to own that economic emergency. You've been in power for 17 years.
But what happens? Because the difference with other governments on the right, we want to make sure that to keep to balance the books, we don't want to do that on the back of the poorest and the vulnerables. So the challenge of my government is to how we're going to make sure that we can maintain all the social gains for the vast majority of Venezuelan people and to confront this crisis.
As President Maduro said in 2014, there is sufficient evidence of US agencies conspiring to put an end to this revolution, to destroy President Chavez. Does he have a point, given there was this coup in 2002, coup attempt, given President Obama said last year that Venezuela is a national security threat to the United States, which seems a bit absurd from where I'm sitting?
Yeah, it's interesting, because I think the US blundered seriously by, of course, signing off on that coup in the era of Bush back in 2002. It certainly radicalized President Chavez. He told me so himself. We spoke not long afterwards. It deepened his conviction that the U.S. was ultimately conspiring against him. And I think in the age of the so-called war on terror, not only Venezuela, other countries that weren't lumped with some of the Middle Eastern countries felt threatened. And this certainly had that effect with Chavez. It was a fundamental mistake. and he went forward from there.
What is at the core of that disagreement, if we can put it politely?
I mean, on the first day when President Chavez was elected, on that first day he was elected, and even before, you have people, a certain elite in Venezuela and their friends here and there, that we started to destabilize, I mean, to work against us.
You don't think Venezuela has anything to answer for on the when people talk about its democratic credentials, authoritarianism, human rights, freedom of protest, freedom of the media?
No, I mean, before and after Chavez, I think that Venezuela is far more democratic than before Chavez, for example, before the Bolivian revolutions.
I didn't know Venezuela before Chavez. I knew Venezuela with Chavez. There were very few political prisoners under Chavez himself. I would say that that's worsened in the last few years. It's deteriorated. I'm critical of the fact that the Maduro government has chosen to imprison people for leading protests on what many people believe to be spurious grounds. I think that has ill-served the image of the Venezuelan government. I think it hasn't helped them here.
Max, do you agree?
I think that a goodwill gesture by the Venezuelan government would be, in fact, to release the people who are considered political prisoners, because, in fact, it's counterproductive in this whole political debate.
Well,
and
maybe
I think.
Because you're talking about images and the fact that 2 years ago, in 2014, and definitely a coup was on its way in Venezuela at that moment. Because, you always look at us, but you have to see also the reaction from the opposition. You have some people from the opposition, and maybe a minority, I don't know, but they never accepted Chavez's election, and then when President Maduro was elected 3 years ago. So it's very easy that, depending on if it benefits to you, you accept the rule of the games and you decide, okay, let's go to elections. For example, okay, they went to elections in December and they won. But if not, okay, we go to the street of Caracas, and Venezuela could be the next Ukraine. That was what's going on 2 years ago. And back to the credentials of definitely for me, I like to compare Venezuela, I mean, what we went through in Venezuela in the last 10 years, a bit like the civil rights movements in the 60s here in the United States, in the sense that it was a process, and it's still a process of political inclusion, where these people that were regarded as second-rank citizens, for the first time they become full citizens. And you have a reaction from a tiny minority of people that they cannot accept that. And from time to time they looked at Europe and the US to get some help.
That's fair?
I would say to a degree it's true. I mean, again, my criticism has been that it was badly implemented. I mean, you have a country effectively without effective institutions. Now, how that came about, I don't know. But it's certainly worsened in the last X number of years. And I believe that the language of confrontation is not proper for a head of state. I think when Chavez,
the language of confrontation?
No, I mean,
I think it's counterproductive, and it polarizes, and it creates even more fervid opposition.
Can the social advances, and there were definite social advances in the Chavez period, I think even critics would accept, can they be guaranteed going forward, or will they all be undone, either through government incompetence or through another party taking over the government and reversing them? Can they be guaranteed? First Jon Lee and then Max to finish.
Can they be guaranteed on what ground? In which?
Do you think, prediction-wise, do you think the gains that were made will be undone in the years going forward because of where we are now?
Well, in a sense, it's being eroded now. I mean, life is not as good as it was a few years ago. I mean, 3 or 4 years ago, there's now a lot of insecurity, food queues, and all of that. I would hope so. I mean, I think this is the same, in effect, this is the same challenge that governments face everywhere. Cuba faces it as it institutes these economic changes going forward. Will the social cradle be there for the Cubans of the future? I think this is the same question, and this should be the bottom line for any Venezuelan involved in politics, whether it's the government today or the opposition coming forward. You cannot take things away from people if they're used to it. If you have a large population living in extreme poverty who are used to receiving some basic stipend whereby they know that they're not going to starve that month and their children can go to school, it is essential that that be guaranteed.
And in an age of falling oil prices, you can't guarantee that to your people, can you?
We will make sure that we can manage to guarantee them. Because you have to remember, when Chavez was elected, 17% of the Venezuelan population were living on extreme poverty. Now, less than 5%. Last year, it fell on less than 5%. What I mean that, and already things were quite difficult on the economic front, but what I mean, yes. And if that's, now we got the opportunity to show to the people, how we're gonna respond to their demands and to make sure that the Bolivarian Revolution keep going.
Okay, gentlemen, thanks for joining me in the arena. We'll have to leave it there. That's our show. UpFront will be back next week.